The documentary begins with a profound, breathtaking silence, the absolute vacuum of the cosmos. The camera drifts through a sea of stars before tilting downward to reveal the Earth, a fragile blue marble swirled in white clouds, untouched by the borders of men. This peaceful imagery is suddenly interrupted by the rhythmic, mechanical scratching of a fountain pen on parchment. We are transported back to a dimly lit study in the early 1920s, where a young, obsessive Hermann Oberth is hunched over a desk cluttered with revolutionary calculations that seem to defy the laws of gravity itself. The room is filled with the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco, a quiet sanctuary where the father of rocketry is dreaming of how to liberate humanity from the constraints of the ground.
In this extended opening, we explore the pure, idealistic origin of the Sonnengewehr. The narration emphasizes that Oberth's initial intent was profoundly humanitarian. He viewed the space mirror as a way to tame the planet. We see beautiful, high-fidelity animations of his 1923 blueprints, colossal, shimmering discs made of ultra-thin metallic sodium, hovering in a geostationary orbit 35,000 kilometers above the Earth. The visual detail is staggering. The mirrors appear like translucent liquid silver petals unfolding in the dark. Oberth's voiceover, recreated, speaks of bringing the gift of Prometheus to the frozen corners of the world. We see his vision of artificial suns hovering over the Arctic, melting polar ice to create new shipping lanes, and reflecting gentle, concentrated warmth onto the dark side of the planet to allow crops to grow in the middle of winter, effectively ending world hunger through a technological spring.
A fascinating and often overlooked detail of this scene is the sheer, terrifying scale of Oberth's ambition. He calculated that a mirror spanning 100 square kilometers could provide enough light to illuminate a city 20 miles wide at night as brightly as a full noon sun. The camera lingers on his intricate diagrams of spacewalking engineers, men in primitive, bulbous, pressurized suits using hand-cranked thrusters to assemble these massive sodium plates piece by piece. There is a sense of awe as we witness the birth of the space station concept, not as a military outpost, but as a celestial lighthouse meant to guide a new era of global enlightenment. The music is ethereal and hopeful, reflecting the boundless optimism of a post-war generation that believed science could solve all human suffering.
However, the tone shifts dramatically as the camera pans from the golden light of the study into the long, cold shadows of a 1930s Berlin hallway. The hopeful orchestral score begins to decompose into a low, industrial hum. We see the original, benevolent blueprints being laid out on a cold steel table, where the delicate notes of eternal spring are being scribbled over by the harsh red ink of military strategists. The narrator reveals a chilling fact. Nazi Party officials didn't care about melting icebergs or helping farmers. They saw Oberth's calculations as a way to hold the entire planet hostage. The light of the sun, once envisioned as a source of life, was now being calculated for its ignition temperature.
The scene concludes with a haunting visual, a close-up of a glass lens focusing a ray of light onto a wooden map of the world. As the wood begins to smolder and catch fire, the reflection in the lens transitions from a scientific tool into the cold, unblinking eye of a predator. We see the transition of the Sonnengewehr from a dream of peace into a sun gun, a weapon that could incinerate a city from 22,000 miles away without ever firing a single bullet. The vast, silent beauty of the stars is now framed through the crosshairs of a regime that sought to turn the very heavens into a furnace, marking the tragic moment when the light of human genius was repurposed to burn the world below.
The scene opens with a jarring transition from the quiet study of a scientist to the echoing cold marble halls of the Reich Chancellery. The ethereal music of the previous scene is replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of military boots and the sharp, metallic clatter of typewriter keys. We see a montage of high-ranking Nazi officials and SS strategists huddled around a massive mahogany table, their faces partially obscured by plumes of thick cigar smoke. Spread out before them are Oberth's original space mirror blueprints, but they have been violently altered. Red circles now surround major global capitals, London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., transforming a vision of global warmth into a cold-blooded hit list. The scene opens with a jarring transition from the quiet study of a scientist to the echoing cold marble halls of the Reich Chancellery. The ethereal music of the previous scene is replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of military boots and the sharp, metallic clatter of typewriter keys. We see a montage of high-ranking Nazi officials and SS strategists huddled around a massive mahogany table, their faces partially obscured by plumes of thick cigar smoke. Spread out before them are Oberth's original space mirror blueprints, but they have been violently altered. Red circles now surround major global capitals, London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., transforming a vision of global warmth into a cold-blooded hit list.
The narrator explains the terrifying shift in ideology. The Nazi leadership realized that the sun's energy, if focused through a massive concave mirror, wouldn't just provide light, it would become a death ray of unimaginable proportions. We see detailed 3D schematics of the revised Sonnengewehr, now redesigned as a weapon of total atmospheric dominance. A chilling technical detail revealed here is the calculation of the thermal payload. German physicists, working under the pressure of the SS, estimated that a sodium-coated mirror of 3 square kilometers could focus a beam of light into a concentrated point that would reach temperatures of several thousand degrees Celsius. This wasn't just a bomb, it was a permanent orbital flamethrower.
The visuals become increasingly dystopian as we see animations of how the weapon would operate. The mirror, floating in the silent void, would slowly tilt on its axis, catching the sun's rays and funneling them into a tight, searing needle of white light. This beam would pierce the Earth's atmosphere, not as a gentle glow, but as a pillar of fire that could boil the water in a city's reservoir in seconds, ignite entire forests instantly, and turn steel skyscrapers into molten puddles of metal. The scene highlights a particularly dark ambition of the Nazi planners, the psychological solar terror. They believed that the mere presence of an artificial second sun hanging over an enemy nation, capable of incinerating their homes at any moment, would force a global surrender without the need for a single ground soldier.
We see the engineers at the secret research facilities in Hillersleben working late into the night, their eyes bloodshot as they try to solve the terrifying physics of extreme solar focusing. They are no longer astronomers, they are architects of a cosmic furnace. One of the most haunting images in this scene is a close-up of a high-ranking officer's hand holding a magnifying glass over a small model of a city, watching as a tiny beam of sunlight begins to blacken the toy buildings. The narrator notes that while the project sounded like science fiction, the Nazi regime treated it with deadly seriousness, pouring millions of marks into research that they hoped would allow them to play God with the very light of the universe. The scene ends with a view of the sun, no longer as a symbol of life, but as a gargantuan, unshielded nuclear reactor that the Nazis intended to harness to burn away any resistance to their 1,000-year Reich.
The camera descends into a cavernous, high-ceilinged industrial hall, where the air is thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and industrial grease. The soundscape is dominated by the rhythmic, deafening clang of heavy presses and the hiss of steam. We are now inside the secret manufacturing heart of the project, where the theoretical sun gun begins its transformation into a physical reality. This scene focuses on the staggering, almost impossible engineering challenges required to build a structure that would be the largest man-made object in history. We see massive sheets of ultra-lightweight sodium being rolled out. The material is so volatile that it must be handled in specialized vacuum chambers to prevent it from exploding upon contact with the moisture in the air. The narration dives into the titan scale of the construction. German engineers realized that traditional steel was too heavy to be launched into orbit, leading them to experiment with advanced alloys and the idea of metallic fabric. We see stunning 3D blueprints of the mirror's skeletal structure, a web of thousands of interconnected hexagonal frames, looking like a giant metallic honeycomb. Each frame was designed to be foldable, like a high-tech umbrella, to fit inside the nose cone of a rocket before unfurling in the vacuum of space. The visual detail captures the sheer madness of the logistics. To create a mirror 3 kilometers in diameter, the Nazis would have needed to launch thousands of supply rockets, a feat that would have bankrupted even a thriving economy. Yet the planners in this scene work with a feverish, blind devotion to the Führer's impossible deadline.
A fascinating technical detail highlighted here is the pressure of light problem. The engineers discovered that the very sunlight they were trying to reflect would exert a physical force against the mirror, pushing it out of its precise orbit like a sail in a gale. To counter this, we see designs for massive, rear-facing ion thrusters, technology decades ahead of its time, that would constantly fire to keep the weapon pointed at its target. The camera pans across a 1:100 scale model of the mirror, where tiny, meticulously painted figures of space workers are seen standing on the rim of the disc, illustrating that this was not just a machine, but an inhabited fortress. The scene reaches a crescendo of industrial intensity as we see the prototype for the orientation hub, a massive ball and socket joint that would allow the mirror to swivel with surgical precision. The engineers are seen testing the gears, their faces illuminated by the white-hot sparks of welding torches, looking like priests tending to a cold metallic god. The narrator reminds us that while the Allied powers were focusing on conventional bombers and tanks,
these men were trying to solve the physics of a structure that would span miles. The scene ends with a chilling wide shot of the factory floor at night, where the skeletal frame of a single mirror segment glows under the moonlight, looking less like a tool of science and more like a giant silver ribcage of a beast designed to devour the world from the heavens.
The focus shifts from the heavy industrial clang of the factory to a sterile, eerily quiet laboratory, where the air is filtered and the temperature is controlled with surgical precision. The lighting is harsh and clinical, reflecting off glass beakers and polished metal surfaces with a cold blue tint. Scientists in white lab coats, wearing thick protective goggles and heavy rubber gloves, move with extreme caution, handling materials as if they were live explosives. This is the heart of the weapon's destructive power, the development of the mirror's reflective surface. While silver or aluminum were considered, Nazi physicists dismissed them as too heavy or inefficient for the brutal environment of high orbit. Instead, they turned to one of the most volatile and reactive elements on the periodic table: pure sodium. The camera captures a mesmerizing, high-detail macro shot of a small block of pure sodium being sliced with a specialized blade. It appears soft, almost like cold butter, with a brilliant silver-white luster inside. However, the moment it is exposed to the oxygen in the lab, it begins to tarnish, smoke, and sizzle. The narration explains the scientific paradox that drove the project. On Earth, sodium is a dangerous combustible metal that reacts violently with moisture, but in the airless, oxygen-free void of space, it remains a permanent, ultra-reflective liquid silver surface. We see complex animations of the vapor deposition process, how the Nazis plan to launch massive canisters of solid sodium into orbit. Once in the vacuum, these canisters would be heated until the metal turned into a gas, which would then be sprayed onto a thin, gossamer-like plastic film spanning miles. This would create a mirror surface of incredible lightness, thinner than a human hair, yet capable of reflecting millions of lumens of solar energy.
The technical horror of this stage lies in the reflective efficiency experiments conducted in these hidden labs. We witness a scientist shining a focused beam of light onto a small, curved sodium plate. The beam it reflects is so intense, so concentrated, that it instantly slices through a thick sheet of lead held several feet away, leaving behind a trail of molten droplets. It is a chilling metaphor for the weapon itself, a material so sensitive that a single drop of water would make it explode on Earth. Yet in the cold silence of the heavens, it becomes the perfect medium to harness the sun's fury. The camera lingers on the liquid-like ripples of a large sodium test sheet, capturing its eerie, mirror-perfect finish, which seems to swallow the room's reflection.
As the scene concludes, the narrator reveals the daunting celestial maintenance problem that haunted the engineers. Sodium is highly susceptible to solar weather, the constant bombardment of micrometeorites and solar wind that would dull its surface over time. We see blueprints for specialized maintenance crews who would have to live in orbit, perpetually repolishing the miles-wide surface using spray-on sodium canisters to keep the death beam at its maximum temperature. The haunting image of a lone astronaut, suspended in the infinite black of space, buffing a gargantuan mirror of explosive metal while the Earth glows below, underscores the desperate and suicidal nature of the project. The lab lights eventually fade, leaving the sodium plate glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence, a silent, metallic witness to a science that had completely abandoned its moral compass in favor of cosmic destruction.
The perspective shifts from the cold, chemical volatility of the sodium mirrors to the haunting human element of the project, the permanent orbital outpost required to man the weapon. To control a mirror of such gargantuan proportions, the Nazis realized they could not rely on primitive automation. They needed a permanent garrison of soldiers and engineers living in the sky. We see architectural renderings of a massive, wheel-shaped space station spinning slowly in the darkness to generate artificial gravity through centrifugal force. The design is a precursor to modern space stations, yet it is draped in the austere, intimidating aesthetics of the Third Reich. The interior is a labyrinth of cramped, pressurized corridors and reinforced observation domes, where the walls are lined with oxygen-scrubbing canisters and analog control panels.
The narration delves into the psychological and physical nightmare of living aboard the Star Fortress. To solve the problem of long-term survival in the vacuum, we see blueprints for space gardens, primitive hydroponic chambers where pumpkin plants and moss are grown under artificial lights to provide oxygen and supplemental food for the crew. The visuals are surreal. Nazi soldiers in gray uniforms tending to vines of green vegetables while staring through thick quartz windows at the Earth rotating below. This station was intended to be a celestial monastery of death, where a chosen few would live in isolation for months at a time.
their only purpose being to adjust the massive ball and socket gears that aimed the mirror's fury at the world's cities.
A particularly chilling detail highlighted in the engineering notes is the relativistic isolation. The crew would be the first humans to truly leave the planet, but they would do so as jailers of the human race. We see animations of the station's docking port, designed to receive high-altitude ferry rockets that would bring fresh supplies and sun gun technicians. The camera pans across the station's command deck, where a massive telescope is mounted. This was not meant for stargazing. It was a targeting reticle. The crew would use it to zoom in on specific streets, bridges, or harbors, ensuring the focused beam of solar fire hit its mark with surgical accuracy. The imagery emphasizes the God complex inherent in the project. The idea of a handful of men sitting in a pressurized tin can, deciding which part of the planet to incinerate with a flick of a switch.
The atmosphere of the scene becomes increasingly claustrophobic as it explores the physical toll of space life in the 1940s. We see sketches of magnetic boots designed to keep the crew from drifting in zero-gravity sections, and the specialized lead glass shielding meant to protect them from the sun's unfiltered radiation. The narrator notes that these men would have been the most isolated human beings in history, perched on the edge of the abyss, fueled by a mixture of ideological zeal and the sheer terror of the void. The scene ends with a wide, lonely shot of the station silhouetted against the sun, its rotating hull casting a long, rhythmic shadow over the mirror's surface, a tiny, fragile bubble of life dedicated to the total destruction of everything below.
The focus intensifies as the documentary transitions from the cold metal of the station to the terrifying kinetic reality of the weapon in action, the moment the sun's life-giving rays are harnessed into a pillar of absolute annihilation. We see breathtaking, high-fidelity CGI simulations of the mirror slowly tilting on its gargantuan axis, its liquid sodium surface catching the unfiltered glare of the sun. In the vacuum of space, there is no sound, only the silent, predatory movement of the silver disk. The narration explains the physics of the solar needle, how the concave shape of the mirror would gather miles of scattered sunlight and compress it into a concentrated focal point just a few hundred feet wide by the time it reached the Earth's surface. The visuals descend into a nightmare of light. We see the beam piercing the upper atmosphere, appearing not as a flame, but as a blindingly white, solid column of energy that turns the air around it into glowing plasma. The camera captures the impact on a hypothetical target, a bustling harbor city in the mid-Atlantic. The water doesn't just splash, it instantly flash boils, erupting into a wall of superheated steam that consumes the docks. Steel suspension bridges are seen sagging and then liquefying like wax, their structural integrity erased in seconds. The narrator highlights a particularly gruesome calculation found in the Hillers-Laban research papers: the atmospheric ignition. The heat would be so intense that the very oxygen in the target zone could potentially ignite, creating a localized firestorm that would suck the air out of the lungs of anyone within a 10-mile radius of the focal point.
A chilling technical detail is revealed regarding the surgical precision of the beam. Unlike a conventional bomb that explodes and dissipates, the sun gun was designed to be a persistent, moving threat. We see animations of the beam walking across a landscape, a slow, relentless line of white fire carving through forests, melting highways, and turning skyscrapers into hollow, blackened husks. The engineers referred to this as landscape sterilization. The camera pans across a scorched earth simulation where the ground has been turned into a sheet of green glass, a phenomenon known as trinitite, usually only seen after a nuclear blast. The visual emphasizes that this was a weapon of total erasure, capable of deleting the infrastructure of a nation without leaving behind the radioactive fallout that would later plague the atomic age. The scene reaches a psychological crescendo as it explores the second sun effect. For those on the ground, the sky would suddenly feature a second stationary sun, far brighter and more terrifying than the original. We see the panicked reflections in the windows of a city, the shadows stretching and distorting as the orbital mirror focuses its gaze. The narrator notes that the Nazis viewed this as the ultimate tool of divine submission. To them, it wasn't just about the physical heat, it was about the psychological terror of a regime that could reach down from the heavens and touch anyone, anywhere, at any time. The scene ends with a haunting shot of the Earth seen from space, where a single brilliant needle of light is seen stabbing into the dark side of the planet, a silent, glowing scar that represents the absolute peak of human malice.
The narrative shifts from the terrifying display of celestial fire to the monumental logistical nightmare that kept the project grounded, the hunt for a rocket capable of reaching the stars. To place a 1,000-ton mirror in geostationary orbit, the Nazis' existing V-2 rockets were like toys.
We enter a high-security design bureau where the walls are covered in towering, multi-stage rocket schematics, the legendary America rocket A-10 and the even more ambitious A-11 and A-12. These were not mere missiles, they were the world's first true space launch vehicles, designed to be gargantuan, charcoal-colored monoliths standing over 100 feet tall, fueled by a volatile cocktail of liquid oxygen and alcohol.
The narration explores the vertical siege of the atmosphere. We see engineers struggling with the math of escape velocity, realizing that to build the Sun Gun, they would need a fleet of hundreds of these rockets, launching in a rhythmic industrial cycle from massive coastal pads. The visuals focus on the brutal power required, the massive combustion chambers, as large as small rooms, designed to withstand the violent, controlled explosion of liftoff. The camera pans across a wind tunnel model of a winged upper stage, a primitive space shuttle, intended to ferry the sodium plates and the station's crew into the void. The narrator notes the dark irony that the path to the stars was being paved not by a desire for discovery, but by the need for a more efficient way to transport the components of a global furnace.
A particularly grim detail revealed in this stage is the resource cannibalization. Building a single A-10 rocket required an astronomical amount of material. The alcohol for its fuel was distilled from millions of tons of potatoes, a resource that was desperately needed to feed a starving population. We see the contrast between the high-tech, gleaming rocket engines and the hollowed-out, exhausted faces of the labor force tasked with their construction in damp, underground tunnels. The camera captures the feverish energy of the scientists, led by a young and ambitious Wernher von Braun, as they push the limits of physics. They were creating the ancestors of the Saturn V, but their goal was not the moon. It was the strategic high ground from which they could dominate every continent.
The scene reaches a technical climax as we witness a static fire test of a prototype engine. The sound is a bone-shaking, low-frequency roar that vibrates the very earth, sending massive plumes of white steam and orange fire into the night sky. The narrator explains that the Nazis were trying to compress 50 years of aerospace evolution into 5. However, the sheer weight of the Sun Gun meant that even their most powerful designs were barely sufficient. The scene ends with a wide, cinematic shot of a forest clearing, where a full-scale mock-up of an A-11 rocket stands silhouetted against a rising moon. It looks like an ancient, dark monument, a testament to a regime that was willing to bankrupt its people and defy the laws of nature just to gain a foothold in the heavens.
The narrative transitions from the roaring engines of the rocket pads to an unexpected, surreal sanctuary nestled within the rotating ring of the space station, the orbital greenhouse. For the Sun Gun to remain a persistent threat, the crew had to survive in the abyss for months, if not years. We enter a pressurized chamber, bathed in an eerie, magenta-hued light, where the walls are lined with rows of transparent tubes and soil beds. Here, the laws of biology are forced to adapt to the vacuum. The visuals are hauntingly beautiful, yet clinical. Vibrant green moss, creeping pumpkin vines, and genetically selected soybean plants clutching onto lattices in the low-gravity environment. The narration explains the grim necessity of this celestial Eden. The Nazis realized that even a fleet of A-11 rockets could not constantly ferry fresh oxygen and food to the garrison. Instead, they designed a closed-loop biological life support system, where the plants would act as living lungs, scrubbing the carbon dioxide exhaled by the soldiers and exhaling pure, recycled oxygen. We see detailed sketches of the transpiration collectors, glass cones designed to catch the moisture evaporating from the leaves, turning it back into drinking water. The scene highlights the unsettling sight of Nazi botanists in lab coats, meticulously measuring the growth of vegetables under the unfiltered radiation of the sun, creating a self-sustaining bubble of life whose sole purpose was to facilitate a mission of mass death.
A fascinating technical detail explores the photosynthetic overload. Outside the station's quartz windows, the sun shines with a constant, violent intensity, unfiltered by the Earth's atmosphere. To prevent the plants from being incinerated, the station utilized a series of rotating shutters and liquid-filled lenses to temper the light. The camera pans across the greenhouse, showing the strange, elongated growth patterns of the plants in centrifugal gravity. The narrator notes the psychological irony. The crew would spend their days tending to fragile, living things, finding solace in the smell of damp earth and green leaves, only to step into the next room and align a mirror to incinerate a city. It was a localized paradise designed to sustain the architects of a global hell.
The atmosphere of the scene becomes increasingly claustrophobic as the camera focuses on the condensation dripping down the cold, metallic hull plates behind the greenery. The soundscape is a low, rhythmic thrum of air fans and the trickling of water, a heartbeat for a machine in the void. We see a lone soldier sitting in the greenhouse, staring at a small flower that has managed to bloom in the stars. The narrator reflects on the absolute isolation of these men, the first space dwellers, whose connection to their home planet was reduced to the oxygen produced by a few rows of soy plants. The scene ends with a wide shot of the station's exterior, where the lush, glowing green light of the greenhouse is visible through a small porthole, a tiny spark of life trapped inside a gargantuan silver predator.
The documentary shifts its gaze from the biological isolation of the greenhouse to the cold, calculated madness of the High Command, the psychological solar terror. We are transported to a dark, expansive strategy room in Berlin, where a massive illuminated globe of the Earth sits in the center. In this scene, we explore the Nazi ambition not just to destroy, but to dominate the human psyche, using the sun as their primary tool of propaganda. The narration explains that the sun gun was envisioned as the ultimate eye of God, a weapon that would strip away the cover of night and the safety of distance, making every person on the planet feel as though they were being watched by a vengeful artificial deity.
The visuals are chillingly cinematic as they demonstrate the diplomacy of fire. We see animations of the Nazi leadership sending ultimatums to foreign governments. Surrender within 24 hours, or the sun will rise over your capital at midnight. The camera captures a haunting simulation of London in the dead of night, where the sky suddenly turns a violent electric white as the orbital mirror focuses its beam just miles away in the English Channel. The ocean glows like liquid magnesium, and the horizon is filled with a terrifying silent light. The narrator notes that the goal was submission through awe, the belief that no nation could maintain the will to fight if the very heavens had been conquered by their enemy. A fascinating technical detail of this psychological warfare was the grand illumination. Documents reveal plans to use the mirrors during the massive Nuremberg rallies, reflecting a pillar of golden light directly onto the podium in the middle of the night, making the leadership appear transcendent and divinely chosen. The camera pans across the faces of a simulated crowd, blinded by a light that shouldn't exist, capturing the mixture of religious fervor and primal terror. The engineers in Hillersleben were tasked with calculating how to flicker the beam to create atmospheric disturbances, artificial aurora borealis, or strange pulsing glows in the sky, designed to shatter the morale of civilian populations and convince them that the laws of nature had been rewritten by the Reich. The scene reaches its climax as we explore the global shadow. The narrator explains that the Nazis wanted to reach a point where they could control the global climate itself, threatening to plunge entire continents into a permanent freezing twilight by tilting the mirrors away or incinerating their farmlands with a focused heat wave. We see a close-up of a high-ranking officer's hand as he slowly moves a small circular shadow over a map of the United States, a gesture of absolute effortless control. The atmosphere is heavy with the scent of arrogance and the cold realization that, to these planners, the world was nothing more than a laboratory. The scene ends with a haunting shot of the sun setting over the horizon, but as the darkness begins to take hold, a small, brilliant star, the Sonnengier, remains fixed in the sky, a permanent, unblinking eye of fire watching over a terrified world.
The documentary's tone shifts from the terrifying heights of Nazi ambition to the cold, unforgiving reality of physics as we encounter the technical fatal flaw that threatened to turn the sun gun into a multi-billion-mark failure. While the propaganda films depicted a needle of fire striking with surgical precision, the engineers at Hillersleben were privately drowning in a sea of impossible mathematics. The primary antagonist was no longer an enemy army, but the Earth's own atmosphere. We see intricate animations of the sun's rays hitting the massive sodium mirror and bouncing toward the planet, but instead of forming a tight, lethal point, the beam begins to wobble and spread. This was the diffusion crisis, the realization that the atmosphere acts like a turbulent, muddy lens, refracting and scattering the light until the death ray becomes little more than a harmless, oversized heat lamp by the time it reaches the ground.
The narration dives into the grueling mechanics of orbital stability. In the vacuum of space, even the slightest vibration, the footsteps of a soldier inside the station, the firing of a maneuvering thruster, or the subtle pressure exerted by the sun's own photons would cause the miles-wide mirror to oscillate. We see a specialized 3D simulation of the leverage effect. If the mirror tilts by even a fraction of a millimeter at an altitude of 35,000 kilometers, the resulting beam on Earth would miss its target by hundreds of miles. The camera pans over frantic, handwritten corrections in German engineering logs, revealing the jitter problem.
To keep the beam focused on a single city block, the Nazis would have needed a stabilization system far beyond the reach of 1940s analog technology. The mirror wouldn't have been a steady pillar of fire. It would have been a frantic, flickering strobe light dancing uselessly across the surface of the ocean or the empty countryside.
A deeper, more insurmountable wall was the atmospheric heat bloom. As the beam passes through the air, it superheats the gases in its path, creating a localized vacuum and a column of roiling ionized plasma. This plasma, in turn, acts as a chaotic prism, bending the beam away from its intended path. We see a laboratory demonstration where a high-powered light is passed through a chamber of heated air, showing the beam distorting and breaking apart into a shimmer effect, much like a mirage on a desert highway. The narrator explains that the very power the Nazis sought to harness was its own undoing. The more energy they poured into the beam, the more the atmosphere fought back, diffusing the light until its destructive potential was lost to the wind.
The scene reaches a climax of frustration as we see the lead scientists staring at a chalkboard covered in unsolvable equations. They were attempting to master adaptive optics decades before computers even existed. The visual depicts a massive sodium mirror attempting to refocus itself, its edges warping and rippling like a dying star as it tries to fight the chaotic fluctuations of the Earth's thermosphere. The narrator notes that while the Third Reich's leadership was dreaming of global incineration, the physicists knew the truth. The sun gun was a paper tiger. It was a weapon that required a level of precision that the universe simply would not allow them to have. The scene ends with a haunting shot of a blurred, weak patch of light wandering aimlessly across a dark map of Europe, a pathetic shadow of the celestial firestorm they had promised, proving that even the most megalomaniacal regime is ultimately a slave to the laws of thermodynamics.
When Allied intelligence teams moved deep into Germany in 1945, the documents seized at the Hillersleben Research Center were transported to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Upon reviewing these plans, American aerospace experts initially believed they were encountering a work of science fiction, but as they delved into the technical details, they were profoundly shocked by the accuracy of the ballistic and physics calculations behind the project. It became clear that German scientists, led by Wernher von Braun and his team, had designed rocket technology not merely to carry bombs, but to establish a permanent military outpost in orbit. These documents included detailed schematics for the sun gun's technical infrastructure, as well as multi-stage rocket engine systems and orbital docking maneuvers. Fearing that these concepts might fall into the hands of the Soviet Union, the United States military classified much of the data regarding the project. Among the seized information were theoretical biological reports on how to protect astronauts from radiation during the mirror's assembly, and how to meet the oxygen requirements for personnel in orbit. When American authorities discovered that Nazi engineers predicted it would take 50 years to complete the project, they realized that this technology was not just a weapon, but a roadmap for the future space race.
Shortly after the war, on July 23, 1945, Life magazine leaked this secret project to the public, causing widespread international alarm. The magazine published technical illustrations showing how the German military planned to use solar rays to boil oceans and erase cities from the map. In the budding atmosphere of the Cold War, this publication provided the first concrete evidence that space could become a battlefield. Through this article, the public learned just how radical Nazi Germany's technological capabilities had become.
The data derived from the Sun Gun project formed the foundations of America's own space program in the following years. The orbital mechanics of the mirrors and the designs of massive launch vehicles were used as engineering references in the lead-up to the Apollo missions of the 1960s. Furthermore, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, known as Star Wars, launched during the Ronald Reagan era in the 1980s, directly inherited the concept of orbital laser or mirror attacks from these early Nazi studies. Today's directed energy weapons and laser defense systems in modern military doctrine are essentially the technological continuations of those first solar focusing calculations made on the desks in Hillersleben during the 1940s. Ultimately, while the Sonnengewehr was never built, it represented the darkest starting point for viewing space as a strategic military domain and pushing the boundaries of rocket science.
The theoretical conclusion of the Sun Gun project rests on the transition from historical ambition to modern directed energy warfare. While the 1945 plans were physically impossible to realize with mid-century technology, the core principles of the Sonnengewehr established the precedent for using the high ground of space as a platform for global power projection. The collapse of the Third Reich fundamentally halted the construction of the sodium mirror, yet the mathematical frameworks for orbital positioning and concentrated solar reflection were never discarded. They were instead absorbed into the classified archives of the superpowers during the Cold War. Technical analysis of the project's legacy reveals a direct line from the Nazi death ray to contemporary space-based military concepts. During the 1980s, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, revisited the idea of orbital mirrors, though the focus shifted from incinerating cities to intercepting intercontinental ballistic missiles using laser arrays. The primary engineering challenge faced by the Hillersleben scientists, precisely aiming energy over thousands of kilometers, remains the central focus of modern aerospace defense. Today, the development of high-energy lasers and satellite-mounted solar reflectors for environmental or military use serves as a technical realization of the same physics the German engineers attempted to master with analog tools. From a strategic perspective, the Sun Gun changed the way nations viewed the sky, shifting it from a vacuum of exploration to a potential theater of total war. The project demonstrated that orbital dominance could theoretically bypass all terrestrial defenses, rendering borders and fortifications obsolete. Even though the mirror itself remained a blueprint, the pursuit of its components, heavy-lift rockets, pressurized habitats, and orbital docking, drove the evolution of the 20th century. The Sun Gun stands as the first instance in human history where science was used to weaponize the solar system's primary energy source, setting a dark foundation for the ongoing militarization of space. The final legacy of the project is the realization that technological advancement, when divorced from ethical constraints, seeks to transform the very celestial bodies that sustain life into tools of absolute destruction. The historical evaluation of the Sun Gun concludes with the profound impact its discovery had on the global scientific community and the ethical boundaries of research. When the technical dossiers were fully declassified, they revealed that the German physicists had already begun calculating the thermal equilibrium of the planet. They were exploring how a permanent orbital mirror could be used to alter local climates, potentially turning fertile regions into deserts or melting polar ice caps to flood coastal cities. This realization shifted the perception of the project from a localized tactical weapon to a tool of global environmental manipulation, a concept that continues to be discussed in modern geoengineering debates. The legacy of the Sonnengewehr also serves as a critical case study in the history of big science. It was the first project that demanded the total synchronization of multiple advanced disciplines, astrophysics, metallurgy, rocketry, and botany, on a scale that had never been seen before. The logistical blueprints for constructing the 100 square kilometer mirror paved the way for modern modular construction in space, influencing the assembly methods later used for the International Space Station. However, unlike modern cooperative efforts, the Sun Gun was built on the foundation of forced labor and ideological extremism, highlighting a period where scientific innovation was inextricably linked to human suffering. In the decades following the war, the Sun Gun became a symbol of the superweapon trope in popular culture and military theory. It forced the international community to draft space treaties and laws, such as the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which explicitly forbids the placement of weapons of mass destruction in Earth's orbit. These legal frameworks were directly influenced by the fear that the Nazi vision of a celestial fortress could one day be realized by a modern superpower. The project serves as a permanent warning of how easily the pursuit of knowledge can be redirected toward the creation of a totalitarian sky, where the sun's energy is no longer a shared resource but a controlled commodity of war. Ultimately, the Sonnengewehr remains a phantom of military history, a project that was physically impossible for its time, but theoretically sound enough to change the world. It marked the transition from the era of traditional gunpowder warfare to the era of planetary-scale technological dominance. While the sodium mirrors never unfurled in the void, the ambition to control the sun laid the groundwork for the modern age of satellites and space-based technology. The project's final lesson is the reminder that the most dangerous weapons are not always those that are built, but the ideas that prove even the stars can be turned into a battlefield. The final assessment of the Sun Gun project focuses on the transition from historical documentation to the modern reality of space-based surveillance and energy weaponry. While the Nazi engineers in the 1940s were limited by the lack of digital computing and advanced sensors, their work on point target acquisition from orbit laid the groundwork for modern satellite reconnaissance. The ability to look down from a geostationary position and pinpoint specific coordinates was the necessary first step for both the Sun Gun's lethality and the GPS technology that governs the world today. This dual-use nature of the research shows how a project intended for mass destruction eventually contributed to the infrastructure of global navigation.
From a technical standpoint, the challenges of energy focusing that defeated the Hillersleben team are currently being solved through the development of solid-state lasers and adaptive optics. Modern directed energy weapons, DEWs, use high-frequency waves to achieve the same results the Nazis sought with solar mirrors, but with much higher efficiency and less atmospheric interference. The Sonnengewehr concept essentially evolved from a massive, unwieldy mirror into compact, high-energy systems capable of disabling missiles or satellites. This progression demonstrates that while the specific Nazi design was a failure, the military objective of utilizing light as a kinetic force was a successful prediction of future combat.
The project also forced a permanent change in international law regarding the weaponization of the commons. The fear of a stationary orbital weapon led to the establishment of strict protocols preventing any single nation from claiming sovereign rights over orbital slots. The Sun Gun served as the ultimate catalyst for the realization that space must remain a demilitarized zone, as a weapon of such scale would grant its owner absolute control over the Earth's surface. This legacy of fear actually accelerated international cooperation in space, as nations realized that the only defense against a Sun Gun was a collective agreement to never allow its construction.
In the final analysis, the Sun Gun remains the most ambitious failure in the history of military engineering. It represents the point where the reach of Nazi ideology exceeded the grasp of physical reality. The blueprints, while haunting, provide a clear record of a moment when human ingenuity was completely detached from moral responsibility. Today, the project is studied not for its potential as a weapon, but as a warning of how the most fundamental elements of our solar system, light, gravity, and orbit, can be reimagined as instruments of terror in the hands of a totalitarian regime.
The historical and technical exploration of the Sun Gun project concludes with its lasting impact on modern aerospace engineering and the philosophical boundaries of human innovation. The research conducted at Hillersleben demonstrated the extreme limits of 1940s materials science, particularly in the study of lightweight alloys and vacuum-stable reflectors. These early experiments provided the first tangible data on how materials behave when exposed to the unfiltered radiation of space, directly informing the development of thermal protection systems used in early satellite designs, and the eventual development of solar sails for deep space propulsion.
The logistical framework envisioned for the Sun Gun, specifically the orbital assembly model, remains the blueprint for all large-scale space structures. The Nazi engineers were the first to theorize that a structure of such immense scale could only be built by launching modular components and assembling them in zero gravity. This methodology was later refined and implemented during the construction of the Mir space station and the International Space Station. While the intent was the creation of a weapon, the engineering logic contributed to the realization that human presence in space requires a permanent modular infrastructure rather than single-use missions. On a strategic level, the Sun Gun represented the birth of the global high ground doctrine. It shifted military thinking from two-dimensional battlefields to a three-dimensional planetary perspective. The project proved that the ultimate strategic advantage lies in the ability to project power from outside the Earth's atmosphere, a concept that now defines the modern era of satellite communication, electronic warfare, and orbital defense. The ambition to harness the sun's energy for destruction forced the world to recognize that technological progress is a double-edged sword, capable of both sustaining life and extinguishing it on a continental scale. Ultimately, the Sonnengewehr serves as a testament to a period where scientific pursuit was uncoupled from ethical grounding. It remains a historical anomaly, a project that was mathematically inspired yet physically impossible for its era. Its discovery by Allied forces at the end of World War II did not just reveal a secret weapon, it revealed the terrifying potential of what a mobilized, high-tech society could conceive. The Sun Gun stands as the first and most extreme example of planetary-scale engineering, leaving a legacy that serves as both a foundation for the space age and a permanent warning about the militarization of the stars. The documentation of the Sun Gun project reaches its final technical synthesis by examining the post-war intelligence assessment and the formal closing of the Hillersleben files. When the United States Army's Ordnance Department released its final report on the project in the late 1940s, it officially categorized the weapon as theoretically sound but practically impossible for the current century. This assessment was based on the massive gap between the Nazi theoretical physics and the industrial reality of the time. The report noted that while the math for focusing sunlight was accurate, the metallurgical requirements for a mirror that would not warp under extreme thermal stress did not yet exist.
The technical legacy of the project was ultimately redirected into solar energy research. Some of the lead scientists who avoided prosecution during Operation Paperclip transitioned their work on concave reflectors from military destruction to domestic power generation. The early designs for solar thermal power plants, which use large fields of mirrors to focus sunlight onto a central tower to generate steam, trace their conceptual lineage back to the orbital mirror calculations. This transition represents one of the few instances where a technology designed for mass casualty was successfully inverted into a renewable energy solution, though the scale of the Nazi orbital version remains unmatched by any modern terrestrial facility.
The final scene of the project's history is defined by the declassification of ambition. In the decades following the initial Life magazine leak, additional files revealed that the Nazi plan included a global weather control phase. Engineers had theorized that multiple sun guns could be used to create artificial high-pressure zones in the atmosphere, allowing the regime to manipulate rainfall patterns over entire continents. This was the first recorded instance of meteorological warfare, a concept that predates modern concerns about climate manipulation. It highlighted the regime's intent to use the space station not just as a weapon, but as a biological and environmental regulator for the entire planet.
In summary, the Sun Gun project remains the most significant what-if of 20th century military science. It served as a bridge between the era of traditional ballistics and the era of orbital systems. While the weapon itself was never deployed, the research accelerated the development of heavy-lift rockets, space-grade materials, and long-range communication systems. It stands as a stark reminder that the tools of the space age, now used for global connectivity and scientific discovery, were originally conceived in the dark rooms of Hillersleben as a means of achieving absolute celestial-scale dominance over the human race.